So, let's start the class off as we normally do with any questions you guys are having. We're going to do a world building lesson today, most likely. So, what are you curious about knowing right now? Nothing at all. Your minds are numb following midterms. Okay.
Oh. I saw an excerpt of Mistborn in, I forget what it's called, Daniel something's new book. So I wonder, how do they get there? Who decides what excerpts go in the back of what paperback?
With Daniel Abraham, we just traded because he's a buddy.
But you guys decided that wasn't Tor.
Yeah, we just did that. We felt like it. They did pretty good. So, no questions. Yeah.
Keep getting requests. People, just want the manuscript, friends, and things like that. And I just keep sending it out to them and I'm reading it. And I'm hoping, waiting to get back responses and feedback. Any advice on how to go about that and adding and subtracting based on?
Right. So you're waiting for the feedback. You are going to get a deluge of feedback if you send it out to a bunch of people. Everyone's going to have an opinion, except your grandma, who's going to just be like, "Oh, this was great. Have any comments? Oh, no, it's so wonderful that you're writing." But all your friends and some of your family, you can come in. Should I split the C's? Let's move over to the side, guys. Get cozy. All right, there you go. So you're going to get this deluge. I should show you one of these. You can see over there. I would suggest taking all that and setting it aside and working on another book before you go to any of their comments. Because they're not going to be trained writers or critiquers. And so the comments are going to vary widely in their usability. When you do look at them, you're going to be looking for trends. That people are consistently saying the same thing. That they're consistently worried about or confused in the same parts, or they consistently don't like a certain character or things like that, okay? Because Stephen King said, and I think it was on writing, he never listens if one person says something. He has to have two or three because he's also one person, and if he thinks it should stay as it is, his opinion matters more than any one person's. But if 4 or 5 start saying the same thing, that's when he starts to think, man, maybe there is an issue here.
How do you include humor in stories? What's the best way to include humor?
Best way to include humor? How do you be funny? Howard always says he hates this question because it's like funny is something you are rather than something you do. So it's very hard to decide. I think the best works are all going to have some humor in them. I usually try to immerse myself in something that has a similar style of humor in order to just kind of absorb it, because studying it, humor is one of those things that gets less and less funny the more you study it. You can study it, but you're gonna want to try to identify different types of humor and say, okay, what is appropriate to the story that I'm trying to do. And that's going to just be your call. For a lot of the books I write, I look for the sort of humor as banter between characters to show their friendship and that they're comfortable around one another, but when that fails, it fails spectacularly. Another type of humor is witticisms. Which I enjoy but aren't really actually that realistic. I love them, but people don't do it that often unless you happen to, be hanging out with just the right people. And they will do them. Just the right people will. But you get those, you watch a bunch of Oscar Wilde plays and you'll end up doing that naturally. And that's what I do. You are going to have to decide how the humor matches your tone. One of the nice things about children's also is that children's allows more flexibility with tone. If you'll go read Harry Potter, you'll notice that the humor and the whimsy, they transition between humor, whimsy, a lot of darkness, and things like that very quickly and freeform, and that works much better in children's. Adults tend to want their books to be humor or not humor. And if you put the wrong kind of humor in, they say, oh, this is a humorous book, and I wasn't wanting to read a humorous one. And so that's why a lot of my focus in adult books is the type of humor between characters, where a character is making a joke rather than the book making a joke. And those are very different things. Okay, yeah.
I'm not asking for spoilers.
Yeah.
How do you outline a larger project, like, say, the Stormlight Archive?
I did it poorly until I had a lot of practice, which is why the original book, time I tried to write the book, it didn't work. This is one of those things that once you know your style really well, you will know it works for you, because the trick is you're going to have to be planning things that you are going to be writing years down the line. So I would suggest for a newer author to just leave a lot of open ends and decide later how you're really going to fulfill them. Now, remember, a good book is about making promises to your reader and then fulfilling those promises. And so the open ends have to be small things, okay? Make your world larger. Mention kingdoms that you're not planning to do anything with, so that you have those seeds later on. Put in throwaways about the world and about the characters that can later be hooks for you in case you decide you want to use them. And your early books, I would try to plan to be more episodic. Now, you may not want to do that, and that's fine. Any rule can be broken. This isn't really even a rule. But, try and do everything and fulfill everything, particularly in the first book. I did this intentionally in Mistborn. I tried to fulfill as much as I possibly could. Rather than sitting down and saying, I'm going to tell this story in 3 books, I'm going to tell the awesome story that most people tell in 3 books in 1 book. And I'm going to try and fulfill all of those promises. And then I will write sequels, building upon that. And I actually wrote the first book with only some vague outlines about the rest of the series, got the whole first book done, and then sat down and made sure my second 2 books then were structured the way I wanted them to. But I made sure that first book fulfilled all the promises, and wasn't, particularly for a new author, and I felt this was very important for me newer in my career, having just people trying me out on my first few books, that they didn't pick up book 1, and I didn't want it to feel like it stopped in the middle. That's okay if you're George R. R. Martin. George R. R. Martin can stop in the middle. People are going to buy his next book. When he did Game of Thrones, he had 30 whatever years in the business. He had an established record, established name, and he can stop in the middle of a story if he wants to. I'm not saying that he did, he kind of did. You shouldn't do that, would be my advice to you. My advice to you would be, imagine that great story, try to do what you can to tell that in 1 book, and then build upon it, rather than saving too much for future books. Okay? There is a danger of saving too much for future books. I mean, like I said, this is the balance I talked about earlier, that you don't also want your book to be... It's that balance of ideas. You want lots of ideas in your book, but you don't want to throw in everything in the kitchen sink, and that's really a matter of tone. But don't save the coolest parts of your series for book 2. I've told you this story, haven't I? There's an author who I met when I was very early in my career. My first book had come out, and his first book had just come out. And he was telling me about his book. And the book, he said, it's going to be awesome. It throws the entire fantasy genre on its head, changes everything. It's very cool and innovative. He was telling me all these cool and innovative things. I'm like, that's great. I can't wait to read that book. He's like, well, that's all book 2. I said, well, what's book 1? He's like, book 1 is great. We'll pull this great reversal. I think I told you guys this, where all the way through, essentially, Act 1 and Act 2, it's your generic story. And then something happens here that changes everything. And then book 2 is just, complete reversal of the entire fantasy archetype. The book flopped. Can you see why? I think I told you guys this. Did I talk about this? The book flopped because everybody who wanted generic fantasy got it and started reading it and hated the ending. Everybody who hated generic fantasy, who would have loved this in the second book, never got past the first few chapters. This is because he was saving too many cool ideas for the second book, rather than doing what he probably should have done, which is start here and write this book as the first one. Or write a more generic fantasy. There's nothing wrong with that. There are people who really enjoy that. Generic fantasy meaning setting and hero's archetype and things like that. I don't think that sells as much as it used to, but there's nothing wrong with people enjoying that. And take off this ending and give them a really spectacular ending that matches all the promises that author was making. Okay? So this is the problem with saving your coolest ideas for your second book. When you're later on, when you're established, you can go ahead and save. You'll know when to save what cool ideas for when. But early on, try and tell the coolest story you can in the first book.